Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
So, but yes, as what I wanted to talk about was Ukraine, and just that we stand by the statement made by ACES, the International Slavic Organization, condemning Russia's military assault on Ukraine and President Putin's use of historical distortions and cynical lies to justify Russia's attack on Ukrainian sovereignty. We stand with the people of Ukraine and Russia who oppose this war. I know that's not what this session is about today, but I just felt strongly, because of what was going on, just wanted everyone to know that that's something that's in the back of our minds that we'll still be thinking about. But we also hope to have our regular Balkan Circle today. So welcome everyone to the Balkan Circle. And for people who don't know me, my name is Mary Newberger. I am the director of the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies and a professor of history at UT Austin. Kirill will be introducing our guest. Kirill's my co-host.
Thank you very much. Again, I would like to thank everyone, to wish him a good and hopefully peaceful afternoon, evening, or morning, as you know, Global Circle is a global seminar by now, and also to thank you for the support and the well wishes for in those testing times. Today, it's not about Ukraine, but we have a very exciting new participant in the circle. For those that do not know me, my name is Kirill Avramov. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at UT Austin, and also a director of the Global Disinformation Lab at this department. And today, as every Friday, we are turning our attention to the Balkans, where we're going to have a wonderful presentation by Dr. Lorand Zsofia, which is titled The Feminist Challenge to the State in Yugoslavia. And our guest today is an intellectual historian of feminism in post-World War II state-socialist Eastern Europe. Currently, she is a Marie Curie Fellow at the Faculty of History and Junior Research Fellow at Wolfson College at the University of Cambridge. Her new project focuses on the heritage of interwar feminism in post-World War II Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the GDR. Her book, The Feminist Challenge to the Socialist State in Yugoslavia, was published in 2018 and has been translated into Croatian in 2020. She earned her PhD at the Central European University of Budapest, a university very close to my heart, where her dissertation got the Best Dissertation Award in 2015. Afterwards, she held positions at the European University Institute in Florence and Lichtenberg-Kolleg of the University of Göttingen. Her further publications include articles about the history of feminist political thought in Croatia and Serbia after '91, the problem of missing women's perspective in the nationalist commemoration of Hungarian history, and the concept of sexual revolution in Yugoslavia, women's rights and political thought in post-World War II, Hungary, among others. For 8 years, she has been also SOS helpline volunteer and a trainer in the field of domestic violence. Without further ado, it is a great pleasure, Zsofia, to be here with us, and I would like to pass the floor to you. Parancsoljon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mary, Kirill, and Molly, for this wonderful invitation and opportunity. And thank you for your kind introduction. Also, thank you for sharing the statement about solidarity and support for Ukraine and the protests against the war in Russia. It's a difficult day to give a talk about history of East Central Europe or Eastern Europe, but it's all the more important. I'm extremely happy to be here, and thank you all for joining us, despite everything. I also have to share with you that I'm fighting a bad cold, so my voice may not always be at its best. I'm going to talk to you about my book, about a feminist opposition group in former Yugoslavia in the 1970s and 1980s. I am going to share my screen. There we go. So the book came out first in 2018 in English, and to my pleasure, and it's a great honor, it was translated into Croatian in 2020. It's a book that focuses on women intellectuals, and this was one of my big experiments of writing a feminist intellectual history of feminist political thought, something that is still very much an upcoming field, not only in East Central Europe, but in general in intellectual history and the field of history of political thought. I am focusing on the relationship between feminism and dissidence, and am very much engaging with the question what socialism did and failed to do for women. The Yugoslav story is quite exciting in this case, because here we have an organized feminist discourse and feminist groups who are people who are thinking together to formulate criticisms from the perspective of women's emancipation vis-a-vis the state. However, it is not only the state they are engaging with, but also the other intellectual groups, popular culture, and in general the public discourse in Yugoslavia when it comes to women and gender relations. What we have here is 3 groups in the 3 big cities in former Yugoslavia: Belgrade, Ljubljana, and Zagreb. And the main centers at the beginning are the universities and the students' cultural centers, where a group called Women and Society, Žena i društvo, is formed. It starts, however, at the kitchen tables with brainstormings and discussions, and also continues in pubs and clubs. But nevertheless, it is academia itself that has proven to be a fruitful discursive space for the first feminist endeavors at the time. This is slowly spreading then into different other fields. I'm showing you here a couple of women: Dunja Blažević, Rada Iveković, Lidia Sklavitsky, Zsana Papic, discussing feminism in the 70s in different public events, especially at the student cultural centers. And this is one of the examples of the journals. It's a very interesting case and tells us a lot about the complicated relations between the Yugoslav state organizations and the feminists, because this is actually published by the official women's organization of the Conference for Women's Social Activity in Zagreb. However, the feminists are allowed and actually invited to publish some of their texts here. Here you find other more independent and critical journals where feminist articles are also published. And then this is when these are the examples of how feminist discourse spreads to the popular mass media, women's magazines, as well as a weird phenomenon some of you may have heard about is the magazine Start, which was a political bi-weekly, maintaining itself independent on the market, which allowed for a lot more freedom of expression, but its income came from the publication of these pornographic images of women. At the same time, you also find here interviews with leading intellectuals, from Roland Barthes to Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem. And the local Yugoslav feminists, for example, the journalist Slavenka Drakulic, whose name may sound quite familiar to you, were able to publish feminist articles in this magazine together or alongside with other dissident or critical intellectual publications. all right. So this is how it starts, and then we reach a point when these women realize that it is time for them to engage with the broader public, and the most important turning point is the discourse about violence against women. I will talk about this a little bit later, and will also mention that the fourth important and big field that I will also jump to towards the end of my presentation is art and literature, and there is a very interesting interaction between feminist theory, feminist politics, and art and literature in this case. The question of dissidence and dissent, as I said, is very much at the center of my book and my way of thinking about the feminists in Yugoslavia at the time. I tend to call them dissenters, but not dissidents. Also in acknowledgement of the different kind of oppression dissidents in the Soviet bloc were facing, but also acknowledging the nuances between the discourses of the different dissident groups, and how feminists in Yugoslavia found it important to maintain an interaction with the state and the leadership of the country, and acknowledging many of the achievements of state-socialist women's emancipation. So what I'm arguing here is that what happened is that through rereading concepts and meanings, integrating ideologies and theories, not only from Western feminism, but also their own version of feminism, New Yugoslav feminism is cooperating with the state, but criticizing it as well. And it offers a case study where the socialist state is challenged based on one of its biggest promises, the equality of women. And I will start showing you how this feminist intellectual discourse was taking shape in the 70s through a quote by social theorist Nadler Safranic, who is, by the way, the only participant from Sarajevo in the group, but one of the most influential people there. So she argues in her essay, The Odyssey of the Human Identity of Women, that, quote, throughout the 1,000-year-long oppression of women, women could maintain a relatively autonomous position while they had to obey those in power and fit into the system and the existing order. By doing so, they remained in opposition, and they managed to preserve a different sociability in themselves with the help of psychological resistance and by constantly reminding themselves of their dissatisfactory position. Importantly here, what we find in these arguments is that the feminists, because they are engaging with the state in the official discourse, which at this point is very much moving away from talking about women as a separate group, as it always has since its establishment. But this is a time after 1975 and the UN Year of Women, when the official women's organization and leading politicians realized the need to reassess the woman question. However, they always argue for a general human question, general human emancipation, whilst the feminists are looking for a specifically female experience, and they use the universality of a shared women's experience to counter the official discourse. They are also very much shaping their own discourse at the time, and this is what Lichtenberg-Kolleg, who is an ophthalmologist, so a doctor from Belgrade, who joins as an activist in the group early on, who told me in the interview I made with her for the book and before that for the dissertation, quote, "We were learning a feminist language. At the beginning, I was always rethinking my sentences, asking myself the question, what would this mean in the vocabulary of feminism? It was not just words we were translating, it was thoughts." So during these discussions, as I said, they were trying to counter this concept of general human emancipation and emphasizing feminism, but they also sought ways to replace discussion about the women's question or the woman question with feminism. And this happens through a lot of conceptual reconceptualization of problems and issues. And I will get back here to the different universalistic claims about women and their lives and experiences. For example, Vesna Pusic, who is a sociologist, wrote as early as 1976, arguing how feminism could be useful for making women's lives better, to approach feminism, quote, as a manifestation of one broad global theory, because we will much more easily get the dimension of the universality it contains. And she emphasizes the need for a theory of social change, and still adheres to this idea that there is a dialectical development of society. The authors Joanna Papic and Ivan Vajvoda talk about women and to focus on women's speech or language, agency and life, and the need of analytical and theoretical approaches, but also personal statements. What they mentioned here is also that this is only seemingly about foreign experience, whereas a lot of this experience of women is universal. What they refer to here is actually their translations of a collection of texts from second wave feminist publications from the US, UK, and France, which appeared in the journal Student in 1976. And interestingly enough, the title of their introduction is Women Are Humans instead of an introduction. So they both play with this general human experience, but which is the official claim, and women's particular experiences. And I'm very sorry, I need to use the tissue, so I will just try to mute myself for a moment. Thank you. I also have to mention here that Joanna Papic was one of the main organizers of feminist activism in Belgrade. She was one of the initiators, together with Dunja Blažević, who was a curator and for a while a director of the Students' Cultural Center in Belgrade. So these women were simultaneously doing activist work and academic work at the time. Nadezhda Čačinović, who is a philosopher and was very much engaging with Frankfurt School political thought, and comes out of the Praxis group. And this is something that I wanted to mention earlier when I was talking about the difference between dissent and dissidence. That these feminists in Yugoslavia in the 70s and 80s have an interesting place in the broader intellectual history of the region, in the sense that they very much come out of the critical Marxism of the praxis school, but also their disappointment with how praxis, similarly to other critical and later dissident groups, is not engaging with women and the women's question, because they consider this in sync with the official claims, something that's already done, already settled. And in the meantime, they bring in and repeat patriarchal patterns, both in their thinking and in the social interactions and professional relationships with female colleagues and students. In another early article, Čačinović is looking at the difference between the concept of equality and liberation. And here, of course, equality comes from the Marxist or Marxian approach to the woman question, whereas liberation is very much a second wave Western feminist term. And she combines the two, and she argues for the need of a liberationist radical feminist approach to be integrated in order for women to achieve full equality. And this is a short quote from her argument, where she says that, quote, the development and reassurance of the quality of a liberated and self-conscious woman turns into a precondition of change in contemporary society. There is a lot that they investigate about women's consciousness and the role of consciousness. And of course, this is another interesting journey of a concept, which comes from Marx, becomes very important for second wave feminists, especially in the US and the UK in the 70s. The women in Yugoslavia who read these theories get reminded essentially of the importance of the concept, and they bring it back into a Marxist discourse, but with a feminist argument at the same time. And Nadala Sofronic, whom I started my talk with, writes, quote, that the radicalization of women's consciousness is in their awareness of their own subordination and exploitation in private life and in their interpersonal relations. End of quote. The personal being political is, of course, another problematic idea in the socialist context, with its focus on the individual and bringing the private sphere into the public discourse. This is what Rade Iveković, who is a philosopher and one of the intellectual, I think we can say she was one of the intellectual leaders of the feminists, mostly active in Zagreb, but also in Belgrade, who claimed that criticism of the family and marriage is already the criticism of the state itself. And this sentence reveals the essential role of feminism, not only in Yugoslavia, but in the entire post-Second World War East European socialist, East European region and these socialist countries. Talking about the private pushes for a reassessment of substantial issues within the society it speaks about, as I already mentioned, the political of the private-public division, the role of gender, division of labor, women's place in society as such, which necessarily means the critique of the perseverance of injustice in the society, which promises a general human equality or a general human emancipation, which is something that very beautifully comes in the art of Sanja Iveković, who is a visual artist and accidentally the cousin of Rade Iveković. her name may sound familiar to many of you again. She's an explicitly feminist artist working together with the activist group, dedicating her entire oeuvre to women's rights and feminism. She brings in the personal and the political through her art, as well as the issue of violence against women. But she also has this fascinating piece with the title Triangle, which to me is a very concise example of how these feminist issues of the critique of the socialist state can be formulated and were formulated at the time. I don't know how much is it readable on my slide, but I will show you the pictures. So the triangle here is between a person on, so we are in New Belgrade with these huge tall buildings, a lot of prefab housing buildings, and this is Tito's last visit before his death, which no one knew, of course, but it's a spectacular parade. Tito in a car driving across New Belgrade, and Sanja Ivelkovic, the artist, sits on her balcony. So here you can see the cars and the people on the street celebrating the leader. And someone on top of that tall building that you can see in the left upper left corner is using binoculars, whilst the artist moves out onto her balcony, reads a book and pretends to masturbate, whilst Tito is marching in front of her house. And all of a sudden, the third actor in this triangle, a policeman, rings her doorbell, knows which balcony, which person, which doorbell, and tells her to remove all persons and objects from the balcony immediately. I don't think I have much time to go into this, but I think you also get the idea that this is very much about the intellectual here, as well as female sexuality and the ignorance of the leader, but as well as the expectation of respect and the personality cult that was surrounding Tito at the time. It also allows us to have a look or have a glimpse into the playfulness in the ways in which feminists were formulating their critiques very often vis-a-vis the state, and as a matter of fact, the intellectual freedom of the time, despite, of course, the certain aspects of oppression that were coming in. But this was this phase of experimentation for this generation with different aspects of a new world. These are the pictures again. As I mentioned, Ivelkovic is also very much working on the issue of violence against women. There is a video with the title Personal Cuts, which I will skip now, but if you want, we can always go back to it during the discussion. It's 3.5 minutes long. It combines a woman cutting stockings on her head, both liberating herself from the stocking, but at the same time, of course, there are these acts of cutting and violence there, mixed with footages from newsreels on the Yugoslav television. And the other one is that I wanted to show you is her piece with the title The Black File, which is also a reflection on the growing sexism and objectification of women in the Yugoslav public sphere. Of course, one of the manifestations of this is also in the magazine Start that I've shown you earlier, but all over the country, with essentially the liberation of discourse and public sphere also meant an increasing objectification of women and sexualization of women, combined with what we know as Yugoslav consumerism. And she's very critical of this. And through this work, for example, what she does is that she combines these sexy representations of women in magazines and popular media with short reports about women's violent death, where when one reads between the lines, it turns out that it was always an act of violence against women that caused the death. As I also mentioned that in my short introduction, violence against women is a crucial topic that is both moving the feminist movement forward and shapes it very much. It is a very interesting trajectory, starting with theoretical interest and fascination with violence against women, which then leads to different forms of activism, and then the knowledge that is acquired and gained through the activist work is turned back into a different kind of scholarship and theory. And it starts with among others, with the philosopher Blaženka Despot, who, by the way, is a generation older than most of the feminists in the group. She is already a professor of philosophy in Zagreb when she joins her own students and starts turning her more like praxis style. She was never a full member of the praxis group. She found a framework too restrictive for herself, but she does critical readings of Marx through the work of Hegel earlier, and then gets interested in feminism, starts reading feminism, and she is the first one who dedicates a full chapter to the importance of violence against women in a Marxist philosophical approach to feminism. She has this very to-the-point quote where she brings together theory and everyday life experiences of women in Yugoslavia. I will read it, but you can also read it for yourself. Quote, besides the question of their participation in the new historical change of attitude to nature, I can't read it. The participation shared with the entire working class of Yugoslavia, women also have a specific problem, a restricted participation in historical events in the sphere of self-management. Self-managers, being their wives too, a proof of the old relationship to nature. So this is a work mostly focusing on Hegel and Marx and their interpretations of nature. And the importance here is about what she argues is that women, even in the Yugoslav socialist discourse, are restricted to mothers, and everything is about the socialist working mother. And this necessarily and always will tie women to her assumed nature, which is always situated as unchangeable, but that also means that it will always remain, that her position will always remain subordinated. And later on, when she writes her book with the title Women and Self-Management, she offers a very detailed taxonomy of different types of violence against women. The other author who is extremely important here is based in Belgrade, even today, is a lawyer and victimologist, criminologist, Vesna Nikolić-Ristanović. She finishes her book in 1989, but already is working on this project for a good 10 years beforehand. And in this book, she very explicitly connects the existence of violence against women with the different shortcomings of women's emancipation in the socialist state in Yugoslavia. And as she writes, the humanization of human relations and of the relations between the sexes and the emancipation of women, the process of socialization of women in the socialist family, this all has not changed significantly in relation to capitalism, which is, as you can imagine, is a very strong critique given the constant reminder on behalf of the state how much better it is for women in the socialist state. So these are the theoretical writings. Nikolic Ristanovich's work is actually heavily building already on the activism that is becoming stronger and stronger from the mid-1980s, especially in Belgrade. There is an activist turn taking place and starting in many ways in the Belgrade group. It is also very much inspired surprisingly, by the Ljubljana group. And it's important to acknowledge here the role of a lot of lesbian women who not only bring in a lot of creativity, but they are in many ways the ones who push the discussions and the framework out of these joint student discussions, where a lot of male participants were often in a way stopping the discussions by asking the same questions over and over again and not wanting to accept the importance of the feminist issues raised by the women. And creating women-only discussion groups, as much as this led, of course, to a lot of ruptures, and many important women left the feminist circles because of this. At the same time, it allowed much more room for discussion of the private, of the personal, violence, abortion, body image issues, women's health, birth. It is amazing. I have a subchapter about this in the book, that you find a lot of discussions about women's rights in the healthcare system and in hospitals, and the issue of birth, breastfeeding, things that actually come back or come into Eastern Central Europe in the mid-90s, late 90s. These are already there in the mid-80s in Yugoslavia, thanks to these feminists. So there is this activist discourse, activism starting, and one amazing example is that you have on the slide is this action polling or street action, which took place in 3 consecutive years in Belgrade, in the central locations. 1 year in Terazije, 1 year on a market called Kalanic Piazza, and for the 3rd time at the main railway station, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. And as you can see, these were the topics that were being discussed. They approached women on the street and asked them provocative questions about how they experience their own lives and positions in Yugoslavia. And I find this extremely important and formative in the sense that all of a sudden feminist politics is out on the streets. And it was a very important beginning to engage with broader masses of women. Of course, the other crucial form of this engagement with women who were not part of the student centers, who were not part of the university, were not part of this intellectual elite. So this other crucial forum was the SOS helplines or SOS telephones. These were the first in the region of East Central Europe. The first one was set up in Zagreb in 1988, but they were already planning to set one up in Belgrade earlier. It was mostly the psychologist and activist Lepa Mlađenović, who was actually also one of the motors of the anti-war protests and anti-war resistance in Belgrade in the 1990s, and is still very active as a political activist and feminist psychologist. So she was one of the mothers, but then the actual realization of the first helpline took place in Zagreb, 88, then 89 in Ljubljana, and at the end in 1990 in Belgrade. It was an previously unimaginable source of information about women's lives, and this was built back into scholarly publications, articles, studies, and meant an amazing platform to renegotiate women's rights. Based on the documentation from the very late 80s, 1990, 1991, there were a lot of negotiations taking place with state officials. There was a willingness to change legislation. There was openness to actually do something to make women's lives better. Whereas this kind of critique was an extremely harsh critique, as you could see the Nikolic Ristanovic quote. This was a critique which essentially had the message that the socialist state has not only not emancipated women and provided equality for them, it is also unable to protect its own citizens from everyday occurrences of violence. So it's an intense topic. It's a hot discussion. There is this promise, and then of course the war breaks out, and all of this disappears and gets transformed into other activities, such as the anti-war activism. These are the women who are at the core of the anti-war organizing in many ways. But before I finish, I would also jump back to this statement by one of the activists. And on this picture, you can see it's actually a picture. It's a picture from the Students' Cultural Center in Belgrade. And this is how the women were sitting together, the activist women, plotting the helpline, plotting the street polling action. And Nina Kadic wrote in 1988 in the journal Oslobođenje about the importance of their activism against violence against women. Quote, "Our goal is to achieve the end of the patriarchal system. Our goal is to stop empty political phrases of women's situation, which have always been up to now reduced to women's reproductive function." End of quote. This is, of course, very much in sync with what Blaženka Despot expresses in terms of philosophy. This becomes much more of a political activist statement with Kadic. And I will thank you with a picture by the artist Sonja Ivekovic. I really like this drawing. The title is "Waiting for the Revolution," in brackets Alice. And you see a young woman staring at the frog. The frog is not turning into a prince, it's changing its colors. And it's in my reading, this is very much a symbol of women seeing revolutions, such as the partisan revolution, with huge promises for them, but it's always the same old patriarchy, just in different colors. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Zsófia.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate, and we understand, especially when somebody is not feeling well, to represent it. Yet it was very interesting. I personally learned a lot of interesting new details, and as a political scientist, I think I will have some questions, for clarification. But first, let me allow my co-host, Professor Neuberger Miri, to have the first question.
Sure. Well, I just also want to tell the audience that if people have questions, feel free to raise your hands and then we will get to you shortly. There's so much rich material here, and there's so many different questions I have, but I think I want to start with one about kind of the relationship and maybe tensions between Yugoslav feminists and Western feminists, who I know they were very much in conversation with. And there's that famous incident of Slavanka Drakulic holding up a tampon at a conference somewhere in the West and saying, "You don't understand our problems, like we don't have these." And her writing about how, very different, I guess, the needs are of women kind of under state socialism, and a little bit of the, I guess, blindness of Western feminists to what those differences might be.
I should answer right now.
Yeah, go ahead. And then we'll just, I'm not going to hit you with a whole bunch. I'll just ask that and we'll see kind of how the conversation evolves. And then I can ask you more questions later as we go.
This sounds perfect. And thank you for this question. It's very, very important. And I actually skipped most of this Western feminism story. And of course, Slavenka Drakulic is one of the most vocal of the feminists about this kind of a critique of Western feminism. It is interesting because she is also the one who is most embedded in Western feminism. She has a series in Ms. Magazine. She works closely with Gloria Steinem. And she also writes in one of her texts that despite the misunderstandings, despite what they often experience as arrogance on behalf of the Western feminists, she also learned something crucial from feminists in the West, and this is democracy. And I think that this is this kind of attention is something that's very important in this entire East-West processes and encounters between feminists. And what I often also talk about is that, you may have noticed, I'm not from former Yugoslavia, I'm Hungarian. And I very much think of the Yugoslav case as a paradigmatic case for the region. And this kind of East-West encounters and tensions come later, early 90s, mostly in Hungary, in Poland, in former Czechoslovakia, Romania. And there, and I think also what the post-89, or in the Yugoslav case, the post-91 turn brings is this clear division between losers and winners of the Cold War, which is actually very different in the 70s. When Yugoslav women, and especially these educated big city intellectual women, are well aware of all the advantages of the socialist system. And they often, when they look at the West and when they read Western feminism at that time, they very often read Western feminism also as a critique of capitalism, which also shows them how actually the socialist approach to the woman question has been more advantageous for women. And this is what puts them in this not dissident, but rather dissent and counter discursive position. There is never it's never a direct transfer from Western theory. It's more like an inspiration to them, which I think is very, very different from what happens in the 90s, when we all start struggling with our inferiority complexes and get into this catching up paradigm in both in scholarship and in politics. Yeah, and maybe to mention that there was this very important 1978 international feminist conference in Belgrade, where a lot of women, mostly from Italy, UK, France, come, mostly left-wing feminists from different groups. And this is much more of a learning from each other kind of encounter.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for this. It's such a complex story. I know it's like a lot to say in a short answer to that big question. Kirill, did you have a question?
Yes, Zsófia, I was very interested in something that you've mentioned, and if possible, to unpack a little bit in detail. And that was you were saying that at the very late 80s, early 90s, before things went and fell apart in completely different direction, a number of policies were renegotiated about women's rights. And it was towards the end of your talk. And there were a lot of, you said, spirit of innovation and sort of the authorities on both sides, certain elites, there was an audibility of some of sorts. So I was just wondering if you can just tell me a little bit more, or tell us a little bit more about the nature of those policies, which were the ones that were open to renegotiation. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's also very important, and it's a huge question. These were very much very detailed issues and policies, and one that comes to my mind immediately was that legislation was changed in a way that in case of a separation, children under the age of 3 automatically stayed with the mother. And this came out of the experience of abused women who often had to escape or flee their marriage, but were afraid of losing especially their small children. There was also a willingness to look at, it was Nikolai Stanovich's suggestion in her book about women and criminology, to introduce some kind of a violence against women specific legislation.
Oh, you mean criminalization of certain? Okay.
Yes, in Serbia. So many of these happened on a Republican level.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.
I have another question. So this is such a unique case, I think. I mean, I don't know that much about, for example, if there were any parallels in more relatively open, like in Hungary, for example, but certainly in Bulgaria, you didn't have something like this, like in terms of openly feminist scholars writing. You had, of course, what people call state feminism, talking about, but again, it's a narrative of women getting increased equality and opportunities, and some of which is very true. But at the same time, like in reading just randomly across archival documents over different topics in my career, you do find a lot of this a sort of self-criticism of in kind of official documents and even popular publications of the situation of women, in which there's a critique of not so much the state, but of men whose consciousness did not change when it was supposed to change, and so there's this idea with Marxism is you change economic structures and political structures, but especially economic structures, and then consciousness should follow, and men should therefore no longer be asking women to like clean the toilets for them because they should, have this kind of these Marxist ideas. But it didn't happen. And so there was a lot of this discussion of like, why hasn't men's consciousness changed? And that's the problem. And so I'm wondering if this was coming from kind of more official sources, in some ways, it is a questioning of Marxism, because very indirectly, but it's like, wait, this was supposed to change and it didn't, now what? But never kind of confronting the state directly. I'm just wondering if that resonates at all with, like, when, in terms of a kind of solutions or politics of blame in these feminist writings, I guess, how do they approach it, and how do they approach that Marxist issue of kind of the, base and superstructure, and what should change?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. It's very much there. So actually, this kind of self-criticism is very much there in the Yugoslav public discourse, but also in the official women's organization discourse, which is led by Vida Tomšič, who is a partisan fighter, but also a lawyer. She's a professor of law, and herself very much dedicated to women's rights. A lot of scholars consider her feminist for what she does. She constantly attacks feminists, but she is genuinely dedicated to bringing a better life to women. And they talk about this patriarchal consciousness of men that is still something that has to be changed in Yugoslavia. So this is there. At the same time, they refuse to talk about women's rights and women's equality as a separate issue because of the Marxist idea of structures. And this is where the feminists come in, and actually Blaženka Despot and Nadezhda Čachinović's suggestion is a feminized Marxism that brings in the feminist component of targeting patriarchy, but also focusing on women and essentially in the level of individual emancipation of women. And then, of course, what Despot emphasizes is that the entire discourse on women's rights, official discourse, is built on mothers. And you cannot achieve full equality if women are only interesting as mothers.
I'm also interested in this Sanja Ivetković's work, and maybe we can even watch that video now, but I did want to say we have a freshly minted PhD student here at UT named Deirdre Smith, who just wrote a dissertation about conceptual art in Yugoslavia in the 70s. And she writes about Sanja in the context of that movement and kind of the other work, but Sanja is the one female artist she deals with. And it's really excellent work. If you want to be put in touch with her, I would be happy to. But I mean, I'm so fascinated by this moment of masturbation on the balcony. And I'm wondering how that fits into theoretically some of the other feminist kind of ideas that were circulating. In particular, I was thinking about one of the ones you talked about earlier on about sort of women's agency and kind of psychological autonomy. And all I could think was, she doesn't need men, basically like there she is by herself, and she doesn't need any of those parades. She doesn't need any of the men. She's perfectly happy with her, her book and her masturbating on the balcony. So I just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how either it fit in and maybe she didn't ever kind of articulate what it was supposed to mean, but perhaps how it was interpreted. But also I would love to see that video if you want to still share it.
I'm happy to share it. Maybe I will share the video first, and then and I would love to. Yeah, I would love to get to know the work of Gerda Smith, and I see that someone asked about Bojana Vidakanic. She's working on this topic also, and Jasmina Tumbas just published a book about performance art in Yugoslavia. So there is. I'm certainly not an expert, and I have to say that what I do is writing an intellectual history and bringing in art and literature in a way that it fits, because we cannot talk about political thought without the political in art and literature. But what I do is a very specific kind of analysis, and I realize that a lot of the aesthetics and aesthetical analysis gets lost there. In the meantime, I'm hoping to add on the political thought end of the story. But I want to talk about the sexual revolution a bit, and I will show you the video.
Thank you. Zsofia, while you prepare, I just want to say that we saw that Susanna Vujovic has raised a question, and I assume that probably Elena Shuvalova. So just let you know that we're fielding in the questions as they come.
Great. That's excellent. And I have to admit that I've never shared a video on Zoom before.
Yeah, I guess the one issue is if you shared sound. When you share, make sure you click the little box of sharing sound at the bottom of the share video screen as you're going into, right before you hit share. Do you see that?
Let me see.
It's like the very bottom left corner. It says share sound. When you, like after you hit share screen, do you see that?
Let me see. So
And there's also optimized for video clip. I don't know.
Share screen, and then and I didn't.
Oh, it looks like it might not be available. Oh, I mean, it's okay if it's.
Yeah, maybe. Sorry, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, let's just go to the questions. It's totally fine. Maybe we can just share the link for that, and then people can go find it on their own.
And maybe the link just changed, or maybe from here it's not. Maybe from Hungary it's not shareable, but from
absolutely. Okay, I can look for it actually. Okay, why don't we go ahead and have Susanna ask her question?
But maybe I just to say about the sexuality issue that that there is a strong critique of this idea of the sexual revolution from the end of the feminist, and actually it's Slovenka Drakulic and then other author, sociologist Jasenka Kodernya, who write more about this, and they use the Marxian interpretation of revolution, which would bring along radical structural change. And they say like, okay, there is this spread of pornography and objectification, but it is not changing anything for women and their social status. And at the same time, especially in the 80s, in the popular women's magazines, there is a lot of feminist discussions about the body and sexuality and women's orgasm, women's pleasure, which is a significant change compared to the previous discourse. I have a little bit about this also in my book. I look at marriage advice literature published before, and then how the feminist approach is different.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, go ahead, Susanna.
Hi, Zsófia. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I have a question regarding the social dimension of the women's movement in Yugoslavia, and whether you found evidence of any efforts to cross the urban-rural divide to draw connections between the educated elite women who you speak about and those in the more rural areas, and also the connection between these elites and the minority groups within Yugoslavia. So whether or not there were any connections forged between these Yugoslav feminists based in Belgrade and Zagreb and those who perhaps may have been centered around Pristina or the Kosovo Albanian women's movement, let's say, where it was at that point. Thank you. Did you hear me? I don't know. I can't hear anyone at this point.
Yes, thank you, Susie. We could hear you. The video was freezing here a bit, but we could perfectly hear you. And thank you so much for this question. It is so. This is one of the things that Yugoslav feminism somehow at the time never gets to really crossing the urban-rural division, as you called it. They are struggling with reaching a broader mass base of women. There were plans to do things. I also think that this was very much the limits of independent social and political organizing in the socialist Yugoslav framework, because with the post-Croatian Spring, post-69 pact between Tito and the students. And in a way, independent intellectual scenes enjoy relative freedom, but there is also an implied condition in this pact that they should remain within four walls in a way. And for example, one of the women in Belgrade, Beda Litvicin, who told me this about learning a feminist language, she and a doctor friend of hers wanted to work in the factories with women, mostly about women's health, but also just in general, and it didn't work. And this was this was on the one hand their fault, and very much came from this naivety that is there in the idea of a universal women's experience, which is politically important for their argument vis-a-vis Marxism and general human emancipation argument. But then it had it restricted whatever they could do, right? Both in thinking and in action. And this is very much the same with the minorities, and this is probably, in retrospect, one of the things that they think of as a mistake, because they were pretty much unprepared for what came in the late 80s, and they were considering women in Kosovo, in Vojvodina, their sisters. But they didn't have a way, they didn't have a language, they didn't have a strategy to approach them, to work with them, to integrate them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think Elena also has a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm the new member of the group, and I'm very grateful to this presentation and presenter. And I was amazed with your development of women activity from the very idea of if a woman is a human to the latest active revolutionary protests and powerful answer. Yes, a woman is a human, and it has a right to have rights, to live, to protest. Yes, I was very amazed with the feel of your book, and I will definitely read it. And my brief question is whether you are going to develop this idea in the other book, or what is the next? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this comment and your question. I really loved working on this book. It was my PhD dissertation. I worked for around 10 years on it, and I loved it till the last moment. And I think it's a huge blessing, as many other academics, I think, can confirm this. It is, I think I learned a lot about how to approach women's political thought, which always falls a bit outside the frameworks of traditional intellectual history. So this is something that I would like to take with me for the new project. I'm going back in time now, and I'm actually looking at how the different interwar negotiations and discussions about women's rights, mostly between feminists and socialists, get transformed into immediate post-Second World War women's emancipation politics in newly founded socialist countries. And I'm looking at the GDR and Yugoslavia and Hungary, which are, of course, three very different cases. But yeah.
Comparative is like in a comparative perspective.
Yes.
Sure. Okay, that sounds fascinating on my end, because basically you will be addressing a gap, and again, from political science standpoint, I think it's exciting because if you have this, historical panorama and then it's put in comparative perspective, then we can think about precisely what still is on my mind when you were talking about those, and I was asking you about those policies, which are in essence representation of the outcomes of the negotiation with power, and their fixation. So, they could be understood better and measured, and in context, very importantly, of larger tectonic shifts at meta level. That means that we're looking forward to a very interesting next book that you're working on, as I understand, right?
Yes, thank you. It's going to take a while. I'm realizing now that 3 countries are really much more than one.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of work. We're not familiar with that.
And you are being told as a PhD student by professors that you will never have this much time for your research again, and you don't. So,
life intervenes. Yeah,
life intervenes. You also end up with jobs and family. Yeah, but
yeah. And speaking of life, I think we're going to finish up here in a minute, but I just wanted to ask one last question, and I was just kind of thinking of the bigger question, which I always puzzle over when I'm teaching students and talking about women and gender history in terms of the socialist period. And that is like thinking about how a periodization, I guess, of women's history. And if you look at the socialist period and kind of what came before it, what came after, I guess this question is, was it a kind of a golden age for women? I mean, can we see it in a different light? That history of that period in a different light if we just look at women, and obviously not. It's much more complicated than that. But if we think about what became before, or what was before, we can obviously see a lot of good and bad. But what I wanted to ask you about is what came after, and I think that's a big kind of question and sort of a lot going on there. But obviously in Yugoslavia, there was the war, so things became very dark, and for those feminists and for everyone. But in general, across the region, just the sort of backlash against state feminism, and kind of how you sort of see that, I guess, transition from socialism to post-socialism across the region in terms of women. And now I know that's just like an enormous question, but I thought I would throw it your way and see what you have. And you can localize that if you want.
Thank you. I think I have to, especially with respect to our time frame, but it's such a difficult period to understand. And exactly when when you look at the post-war, the immediate post-war, and what this meant, that women's access to education, this is something that I always emphasize about this period, because education is power, and the speed at which women get alphabetized at the time, access to the economic emancipation, the idea the way our ideas about childcare and caring responsibilities were transformed. These are super important, and of course the post-89 phase in many ways is a backlash. On the other hand, especially coming from a context, and I was alive during socialist times for quite some time already. But I think that when you don't have platforms for women to organize and to share and to think together, and when you have a restricted space of expression and public sphere, then women's rights can never be fully achieved or accomplished. And this is something that we also have to bear in mind about this period.
Well, thank you so much for this thought-provoking talk and all of your answers to our questions. You've left us with a lot to think about, not just for the former Yugoslavia, but for the region in general. And so I want to thank you and all of our audience for coming, and just give you one last round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do appreciate it. And again, I would like to thank our audience, our speaker today. Again, times are very tense. We're gearing out and we're hoping that everyone will be safe and sound. Köszönjük szépen, and jó estét kívánok.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and you had wonderful questions and comments. Thank you.